I recall another animal of different temperament, turned over to me by the quartermaster after capture, in exchange, as usual, for one of my own horses. In the Valley of Virginia, during the retreat of the Union General Milroy, my men captured a horse of magnificent appearance and handsomely caparisoned. He was solid black in colour and dangerously treacherous in disposition. He was brought to me by his captors with the statement that he was General Milroy's horse, and he was at once christened Milroy by my men. I have no idea that he belonged to the general, for that officer was too true a soldier to have ridden such a beast in battle, certainly not after one test of his cowardice. His fear of minnie-balls was absolutely uncontrollable. He came near disgracing me in the first and only fight in which I attempted to ride him. Indeed, if it had chanced to be my first appearance under fire with my men, they would probably have followed my example as they saw me flying to the rear on this elephantine brute. He was an immense horse of unusually fine proportions, and had behaved very well under the cannonading, but as we drew nearer the blue lines in front, and their musketry sent the bullets whistling around his ears, he wheeled and fled at such a rate of speed that I was powerless to check him until he had carried me more than 100 yards to the rear. Fortunately, some of the artillerymen aided me in dismounting, and promptly gave me a more reliable steed. On horseback, I rapidly returned in time to redeem my reputation. My obligations to General Milroy were very great for having evacuated at night the fort at Winchester, near which this horse was captured, and for permitting us to move over its deserted and silent ramparts in perfect security. But if this huge black horse were really his, General Milroy, in leaving him for me, had cancelled all the obligations under which he had placed me. This Georgia Brigade, with its 6 splendid regiments, whose war acquaintance I had made at Mary's Heights, contributed afterward from their pittance of monthly pay, and bought, without my knowledge, at a fabulous price, a magnificent horse, and presented him to me. These brave and self-denying men realized that such a horse would cost more than I could pay. He gave me great comfort, and I hoped that, like Mary, he might go unscathed through successive battles. But at Monocacy, in Maryland, he paid the forfeit of his life by coming in collision with a whizzing missile as he was proudly galloping along my lines, then advancing upon General Lew Wallace's forces. I deeply regretted this splendid animal's death, not only because of his great value at the time, but far more because he was the gift of my gallant men. In one of the battles in the Wilderness, in 1864, and during a flank movement, a thoroughbred bay stallion was captured, a magnificent creature, said to have been the favourite war horse of General Shaler, whom we also captured. As was customary, the horse was named for his former master, and was known by no other title than General Shaler. My obligations to this horse are twofold and memorable. He saved me from capture when I had ridden, by mistake, into Sedgwick's corps by night, and at Appomattox he brought me enough greenbacks to save me from walking back to Georgia. He was so handsome that a Union officer, who was a judge of horses, asked me if I wished to sell him. I at once assured this officer that I would be delighted to sell the horse or anything else I possessed, as I had not $1 except Confederate money, which at that period of its history was somewhat below par. The officer, General Curtin of Pennsylvania, generously paid me in greenbacks more than I asked for the horse. I met this gentleman in 1894, nearly 30 years afterward, at Williamsport, Pennsylvania. He gratified me again by informing me that he had sold General Shaler for a much higher price than he paid me for him. If there is a hereafter for horses, as there is a heaven for the redeemed among men, I fear that the old black traitor that ran away with me from the fight will never reach it, but the brave and trusty steeds that so gallantly bore their riders through our American Civil War will not fail of admittance. Job wrote of the war horse that smelleth the battle from afar off. Alexander the Great had his Bucephalus, that dashed away as if on wings as his daring master mounted him. Zachary Taylor had his Old Whitey, from whose mane and tail the American patriots pulled for souvenirs nearly all the hairs, as he grazed on the green at the White House. Lee had his Traveller, whose memory is perpetuated in enduring bronze. Stonewall Jackson had his high-mettled Old Sorrel, whose life was nursed with tenderest care long after the death of his immortal rider. But if I were a poet, I would ignore them all and embalm in song my own glorious Mary, whose spirit I would know was that of Joan of Arc, if the transmigration of souls were true. Chapter 9. War by the Brave Against the Brave. Inimitable storyteller, Governor Robert Taylor of Tennessee, delights his hearers by telling in charming style of a faithful colored man, Allen, a slave of his father's. Both Allen and his owner were preachers, and Allen was in the habit each Saturday afternoon of going to his master and learning from him what his text for the following day's sermon would be. On this occasion, the Rev. Dr. Taylor informed the Rev. Allen that his text for the morrow would be the words, "And he healed them of divers diseases." "Yes, sir," said Allen, "that's a mighty good text, and hit will be mine for my Sunday sermon." Sunday came, and Allen was ready. He announced his text in these words, "And he healed them of all sorts of diseases, and even of that worst of complaints called de divers." Proceeding to an elucidation of his text, he described with much particularity the different kinds of diseases that earthly doctors could cure, and then, with deepest unction, said, "But my congregation, if de divers ever gets one of you, jest make up your mind you's a gone nigger, tepin de Lord save you." In 1861, a disorder had taken possession of the minds of the people in every section of the country. Internecine war, contagious, infectious, confluent, was spreading, and destined to continue spreading until nearly every home in the land was affected and hurt by it. This dreadful disease had about it some wonderful compensations. No one went through it from a high sense of duty without coming out of it a braver, a better, and a more consecrated man. It is a great mistake to suppose that war necessarily demoralizes and makes obdurate those who wage it. Doubtless wars of conquest, for the sake of conquest, for the purpose of despoiling the vanquished and enriching the victors, and all wars inaugurated from unhallowed motives, do demoralize every man engaged in them, from the commanding general to the privates. But such was not the character of our Civil War. On the contrary, it became a training school for the development of an unselfish and exalted manhood, which increased in efficiency from its opening to its close. At the beginning there was personal antagonism and even bitterness felt by individual soldiers of the two armies toward each other. The very sight of the uniform of an opponent aroused some trace of anger. But this was all gone long before the conflict had ceased. It was supplanted by a brotherly sympathy. The spirit of Christianity swayed the hearts of many, and its benign influence was perhaps felt by the great majority of both armies. The Reverend Charles Lane, recently a member of the faculty of the Georgia Technological Institute, told me of a soldier who could easily have captured or shot his antagonist at night, but the religious devotion in which that foe at the moment was engaged shielded him from molestation, and he was left alone in communion with his God. That knightly soldier of the Confederacy, whose heart so promptly sympathized with his devout antagonist, was also a soldier of the cross. The same spirit was shown in the case of a Pennsylvania soldier who was attracted by the songs in a Confederate prayer meeting and, without the slightest fear of being detained or held as prisoner, attempted in broad daylight to cross over and join the Confederates in their worship. He was ordered back by his own pickets, but his officers appreciated his impulsi, and he was not subjected to the slightest punishment. In a European army, he most likely would have been shot for attempted desertion, although he had made no effort whatever to conceal his movements or his purposes. The broadening of this Christian fellowship was plainly seen as the war progressed. The best illustration of this fact which I now recall is the contrast between the impulses which moved the two soldiers just mentioned and that which inspired the quaint prayer of a devout Confederate at the beginning of the war and at the grave of his dead comrade. He concluded his prayer in about these words, "And now, Lord, we commit the body of our comrade to the grave, with the hope of meeting him again, with all the redeemed, in that great day and in the home prepared for thy children. For we are taught to believe that thy true followers shall come from the east and west as well as from the south, and we cannot help hoping, Lord, that a few will come even from the north. It was not alone in the religious life of the army that these evidences of expanding brotherhood were exhibited. I should, perhaps, not exaggerate the number or importance of these evidences if I said that there were thousands of them which are perhaps the brightest illustrations and truest indices of the American soldier's character. In 1896, an officer of the Union Army told me the following story, which is but a counterpart of many which came under my own observation. A lieutenant of a Delaware regiment was officer of the picket line on the banks of the Rappahannock. The pickets of the two armies were, as was usual at that time, very near each other and in almost constant communication. It was in midwinter, and no movements of the armies were expected. The Confederate officer of pickets, who was on duty on the opposite bank of the narrow stream, asked the Union lieutenant if he would not come over after dark and go with him to a farmhouse near the lines, where certain Confederates had invited the country girls to a dance. The Union officer hesitated, but the Confederate insisted, and promised to call for him in a boat after dark, and to lend him a suit of citizen's clothes, and pledged his honour as a soldier to see him safely back to his own side before daylight the next morning. The invitation was accepted, and at the appointed hour the Confederate's boat glided silently to the place of meeting on the opposite bank. The citizen's suit was a ludicrous fit, but it served its purpose. The Union soldier was introduced to the country girls as a new recruit just arrived in camp. He enjoyed the dance, and, returning with his Confederate escort, was safely landed in his own lines before daylight. Had the long roll of the kettle drum summoned the armies to battle on that same morning, both these officers would have been found in the lines under hostile ensigns, fighting each other in deadly conflict. In Kansas City recently, an ex-Confederate recorded his name upon the hotel register. Mr. James Locke, of Company E, 100th Pennsylvania Volunteers, was in the same hotel, and observed the name on the register. Locke had lost a leg at the Second Manassas, and a Confederate had carried him out of the railroad cut in which he lay suffering, and had ministered to his wants as best he could. Locke had asked this soldier in grey before leaving him to write his name in his, Locke's, war diary. The Confederate did so, and was then compelled to hurry forward with his command. He had, however, in the spirit of a true soldier, provided the suffering Pennsylvanian with a canteen of water before he left him. There was nothing unmanly in the moistened eyes of these brave men when they so unexpectedly and after so many years met in Kansas City for the first time since they parted at the railroad cut on a Virginia battlefield. This spirit of American chivalry was exhibited almost everywhere on the wonderful retreat of Joseph E. Johnston before General Sherman from Dalton to Atlanta. At Resaca, at Kennesaw, along the banks of Peachtree Creek, and around Atlanta, between the lines that encircled the doomed city, the same friendly greetings were heard between the pickets, and the same evidences of comradeship shown before the battles began and after they had ended. In the trenches around Vicksburg, and during its long and terrible bombardment, the men in the outer lines would call to each other to stop firing for a while, that they wanted to get out into fresh air. The call was always heeded, and both sides poured out of their bomb-proofs like rats from their holes when the cats are away. And whenever an order came to open fire, or the time had expired, they would call, "Hello there, Johnny," or "Hello there, Yank," as the case might be. "Get into your holes now, we are going to shoot." What could have been more touchingly beautiful than that scene on the Rapidan when, in the April twilight, a great band in the Union Army suddenly broke the stillness with the loved strains of Hail Columbia, Happy Land, calling from the Union camp's huzzas, that rolled like reverberating thunders on the evening air. Then, from the opposite hills and from Confederate bands, the answer came in the thrilling strains of Dixie. As it always does, and perhaps always will, Dixie brought from Southern throats an impassioned response. Then, as if inspired from above, came the union of both in that immortal anthem, "Home, Sweet Home." The solemn and swelling cadence of these old familiar notes was caught by both armies, and their joint and loud acclamations made the climax of one of the most inspiring scenes ever witnessed in war. The talking and joking, the trading and swapping, between the pickets and between the lines, became so prevalent before the war closed as to cause no comment and attract no special attention, except when the intercourse led the commanding officers to apprehend that important information might be unwittingly imparted to the foe. On the Rapidan and Rappahannock, into which the former emptied, this rollicking sort of intercourse would have been alarming in its intimacy but for the perfect confidence which the officers of both sides had in their men. Even officers on the opposite banks of this narrow stream would now and then declare a truce among themselves, in order that they might bathe in the little river. Where the water was shallow, they would wade in and meet each other in the centre and shake hands, and swap newspapers and barter Southern tobacco for Yankee coffee. Where the water was deep, so that they could not wade in and swap, they sent the articles of traffic across in miniature boats, laden on the southern shore with tobacco, and sailed across to the Union side. These little boats were unloaded by the Union soldiers, reloaded and sent back with Yankee coffee for the Confederates. This extraordinary international commerce was carried on to such an extent that the commanders of both armies concluded it was best to stop it. General Lee sent for me on one occasion and instructed me to break up the traffic. Riding along the lines, as I came suddenly and unexpectedly around the point of a hill upon one of the Confederate posts, I discovered an unusual commotion and confusion. I asked, "What's the matter here? What is all this confusion about?" "Nothing at all, sir. It's all right here, General." I expressed some doubt about its being all right, when the spokesman for the squad attempted to concoct some absurd explanation as to their effort to get ready to present arms to me as I came up. Of course, I was satisfied that this was not true, but I could see no evidence of serious irregularity. As I started, however, I looked back and discovered the high weeds on the bank shaking and wheeling my horse. I asked, "What's the matter with those weeds?" "Nothing at all, sir," he declared, but I ordered him to break the weeds down. There I found a soldier almost naked. I asked, "Where do you belong?" "Over yonder," he replied, pointing to the Union Army on the other side. "And what are you doing here, sir?" "Well, General," he said, "I didn't think it was any harm to come over and see the boys just a little while." "What boys?" I asked. "These Johnnies," he said. "Don't you know, sir, that there is war going on in this country?" I asked. "Yes, General," he replied, "but we are not fighting now." The fact that a battle was not then in progress, given as an excuse for social visiting between opposing lines, was so absurd that it overturned my equilibrium for the moment. If my men could have known my thoughts, they would have been as much amused at my discomfiture as I was at the Union visitors' reasoning. An almost irresistible impulse to laugh outright was overcome, however, by the necessity for maintaining my official dignity. My instructions from General Lee had been to break up that traffic and intercourse, and the slightest lowering of my official crest would have been fatal to my mission. I therefore assumed the sternest aspect possible under the circumstances, and ordered the Union soldier to stand up, and I said to him, "I am going to teach you, sir, that we are at war. You have no rights here except as a prisoner of war, and I am going to have you marched to Richmond and put you in prison." This terrible threat brought my own men quickly and vigorously to his defence, and they exclaimed, "Wait a minute, General. Don't send this man to prison. We invited him over here, and we promised to protect him, and if you send him away, it will just ruin our honour." The object of my threat had been accomplished. I had badly frightened the northern guest and his southern hosts. Turning to the scantily clad visitor, I said, "Now, sir, if I permit you to go back to your own side, will you solemnly promise me, on the honour of a soldier, that—" But without waiting for me to finish my sentence, and with an emphatic, "Yes, sir," he leapt like a bullfrog into the river and swam back. I recall several incidents which do not illustrate precisely the same elements of character, but which show the heroism found on both sides, of which I know few, if any, parallels in history. After the Battle of Sharpsburg, there was sent to me as an aide on my staff a very young soldier, a mere stripling. He was at that awkward, gawky age through which all boys seem to pass. He bore a letter, however, from the Honda Thomas Watts of Alabama, who was the Attorney General of the Confederate States, and who assured me that this lad had in him all the essentials of a true soldier. It was not long before I found that Mr. Watts had not mistaken the mettle of his young friend, Thomas G. Jones. Late one evening, near sunset, I directed Jones to carry a message from me to General Lee or to my immediate superior. The route was through pine thickets and along dim roads or paths not easily followed. The Union pickets were posted at certain points in these dense woods, but Jones felt sure that he could go through safely. Alone on horseback, he started on his hazardous ride. Darkness overtook him before he had emerged from the pine thicket, and he rode into a body of Union pickets, supposing them to be Confederates. There were 6 men on that post. They seized the bridle of Jones's horse, levelled their rifles at him, and ordered him to dismount. As there was no alternative, one can imagine that Jones was not slow in obeying the order. His captors were evidently new recruits, for they neglected to deprive him of the 6-shooter at his belt. Jones even then had in him the oratorical power which afterward won for him distinction at the bar and helped to make him governor of the great state of Alabama. He soon engaged his captors in the liveliest conversation, telling them anecdotes and deeply enlisting their interest in his stories. The night was cold, and before daylight Jones adroitly proposed to the boys that they should make a fire, as there was no reason for shivering in the cold with plenty of pine sticks around them. The suggestion was at once accepted, and Jones began to gather sticks. The men, unwilling for him to do all the work, laid down their guns and began to share in this labour. Jones saw his opportunity, and burning with mortification at his failure to carry through my message, he leapt to the pile of guns, drew his revolver, and said to the men, "I can kill every one of you before you can get to me. Fall into line. I will put a bullet through the first man who moves toward me." He delivered those 6 prisoners at my headquarters. I do not now recall the name of the Confederate who was selected on account of his conspicuous courage as the colour-bearer of his regiment, and who vowed as he received the flag that he would never surrender it. At Gaines's Mill, he fell in the forefront of the fight with a mortal wound through his body. Raising himself on his elbow, he quietly tore his battle flag from the staff, folded it under him, and died upon it. At Big Falls, North Carolina, there lived in 1897 a one-armed soldier whose heroism will be cited by orators and poets as long as heroism is cherished by men. He was a colour-bearer of his regiment, the 13th North Carolina. In a charge during the first day's battle at Gettysburg, his right arm, with which he bore the colours, was shivered and almost torn from its socket. Without halting or hesitating, he seized the falling flag in his left hand, and, with his blood spouting from the severed arteries and his right arm dangling in shreds at his side, he still rushed to the front, shouting to his comrades, "Forward! Forward!" The name of that modest and gallant soldier is W.F. Fawcett. At Gettysburg, a Union colour-bearer of one of General Barlow's regiments, which were guarding the right flank of General Meade's army, exhibited a similar dauntless devotion in defence of his colours. As my command charged across the ravine and up its steep declivity, along which were posted the Union troops, the fight became on portions of the line a hand-to-hand struggle. This lion-hearted colour-bearer of a Union regiment stood firmly in his place, refusing to fly, to yield his ground, or to surrender his flag. As the Confederates crowded around him and around the stalwart men who still stood firmly by him, he became engaged in personal combat with the colour-bearer of one of my Georgia regiments. What his fate was I do not now recall, but I trust and believe that his life was spared. I sincerely pity the man who calls himself an American and who does not find in these exhibitions of American manhood on either side a stimulant to his pride as an American citizen and a support to his confidence in the American Republic. The true patriot must necessarily feel a glow of sincere pride in the record of the Republic's great and heroic sons from every section. There is no inconsistency, however, between a special affection for one's birthplace and a general love for one's entire country. There is nothing truer than that the love of the home is the unit, and that the sum of these units is aggregated patriotism. What would be thought of the patriotism of a son of New England, or of the Old Dominion whose heart did not warm at the mention of Plymouth Rock or of Jamestown? An incident in the war experience of General Newton M. Curtis, a leading and influential Republican member of Congress from New York, is worthy of record. A finer specimen of physical manhood it would be difficult to find. 6 feet 6 inches in height, erect as the typical Indian, he weighs 232 pounds. But if he were 6 feet 12 and weighed twice as much, his body would not be big enough to contain the great soul which inhabits it. He had one eye shot out by a Confederate bullet, but if he had lost both, his lofty spirit would have seen as clearly as now that the war was fought in defence of inherited belief, and that when it ended, the Union was more closely cemented than ever. Near Fairfax Courthouse, during the war in that portion of Virginia which had been devastated by both armies, biting want necessarily came to many families near the border, particularly to those whose circumstances made it impossible for them to remove to a distant part of the state. From within the Union lines there came into the Union camps one chilly day a Virginia lady. She was weak and pale and thinly clad, and rode an inferior horse, with a faithful old Negro as her only escort. She had come to solicit from the commissary department of the Union Army supplies with which to feed her household. The orders to the commissary department in the field were necessarily stringent. The supplies did not belong to the officer in charge, but were the property of the government. That officer, therefore, had no right to donate anything even to the most deserving case of charity, except according to the orders. And the orders required all applicants for supplies to take the oath of allegiance to the United States before such supplies could be furnished. This hungry and wan woman was informed that she could have the necessaries for which she asked upon subscribing to that oath. What was she to do? Her kindred, her husband and son, were soldiers in the Confederate Army. If she refused to take the oath, what would become of her and those dependent upon her? If she took the oath, what was to become of her own convictions and her loyalty to the cause of those she loved? It is not necessary to say that her sense of duty and her fidelity to the Southern cause triumphed. Sad and hungry, she turned away, resolved to suffer on. But General Curtis was in that camp. He had no power to change the orders, and no disposition to change them, and he would have scorned to violate a trust. For there was no braver or more loyal officer in the Union Army. He had, however, in his private purse some of the money which he had earned as a soldier, and he illustrated in his character that native knighthood which ennobles its possessor while protecting, befriending, and blessing the weak or unfortunate. It is enough to add that this brave and suffering Virginia woman did not leave the Union camp empty-handed. I venture the opinion that General Curtis would not exchange the pleasure which that act gave him at the time, and has given him for the 30 years since for the amount of money expended, multiplied many times over. In 1863, when General Longstreet's forces were investing the city of Knoxville, Tennessee, there occurred an incident equally honorable to the sentiment and spirit of Confederate and Federal. During a recent visit to that city, a party representing both sides in that engagement accompanied me to the great fort, which General Longstreet's forces assailed but were unable to capture. These representatives of both armies united in giving me the details of the incident. The Southern troops had made a bold assault upon the fort. They succeeded in reaching it through a galling fire and attempted to rush up its sides, but were beaten back by the Union men who held it. Then, in the deep ditch surrounding the fortress and at its immediate base, the Confederates took their position. They were, in a measure, protected from the Union fire, but they could neither climb into the fort nor retreat except at great sacrifice of life. The sun poured its withering rays upon them, and they were famishing with thirst. A bold and self-sacrificing young soldier offered to take his life in his hands and canteens on his back and attempt to bring water to his fainting comrades. He made the dash for life and for water, and was unhurt. But the return, how was that to be accomplished? Laden with the filled and heavy canteens, he approached within range of the rifles in the fort and looked anxiously across the intervening space. He was fully alive to the fact that the chances were all against him, but determined to relieve his suffering comrades or die in the effort, he started on his perilous run for the ditch at the fort. The brave Union soldiers stood upon the parapet with their rifles in hand. As they saw this daring American youth coming, with his life easily at their disposal, they stood silently contemplating him for a moment. Then, realizing the situation, they fired at him a tremendous volley not of deadly bullets from their guns, but of enthusiastic shouts from their throats. If the annals of war record any incident between hostile armies which embodies a more beautiful and touching tribute by the brave to the brave, I have never seen it. And now, what is to be said of these incidents? How much are the few recorded in this chapter worth? To the generations that are to follow, what is their value, and the value of the tens of thousands which ought to be chronicled? Do they truly indicate that the war did lift the spirit of the people to better things? Was it really fought in defence of cherished convictions? And did it bury in its progress the causes of sectional dissensions? Did it develop a higher manhood in the men, and did it reveal in glorious light the latent but ever-living heroism of our women? The heroines of Sparta who gave their hair for bowstrings have been immortalized by the muse of history. But what tongue can speak or pen indite a tribute worthy of that Mississippi woman who with her own hands applied the torch to more than $500,000 worth of cotton, reducing herself to poverty rather than have that cotton utilized against her people? The day will come, and I hope and believe it is rapidly approaching, when in all the sections will be seen evidences of appreciation of these inspiring incidents, when all lips will unite in expressing gratitude to God that they belong to such a race of men and women, when no man who loves his country will be found grovelling among the embers and ignoble passions of the past, but will aid in developing a still nobler national life by inviting the youth of our country to a contemplation of the true glories of this memorable war. In my boyhood, I witnessed a scene in nature which it now seems to me fitly symbolizes that mighty struggle and the view of it which I seek to present. Standing on a mountain top, I saw two storm clouds lowering in the opposite horizon. They were heavily charged with electric fires. As they rose and approached each other, they extended their length and gathered additional blackness and fury. Higher and higher they rose, their puffing windcaps rolling like hostile banners above them, and when nearing each other, the flashing lightning blazed along their front and their red bolts were hurled into each other's bosoms. Finally, in mid-heavens they met, and the blinding flashes and fearful shocks filled my boyish spirit with awe and terror. But God's hand was in that storm, and from the furious conflict copious showers were poured upon the parched and thirsty earth, which refreshed and enriched it. Chapter 10. Retrospective view of leaders and events. The next promontories on the war's highway which come into view are Gettysburg, Vicksburg, and Chickamauga, and these suggest a retrospective view of the entire field over which the armies had been marching, and of the men who had been leading them. The battles of 1861-62 and of the winter of 1863 had left the South still confident of success in securing her independence, and the North still fully resolved on maintaining the integrity of the Union. In Virginia, the Confederates had won important victories at Bull Run, in the 7 days' battles around Richmond, at Harper's Ferry, with the surrender of the Union forces to Jackson, at Second Manassas, at Fredericksburg, in the Valley, and at Chancellorsville, and had claimed a drawn battle at Sharpsburg Antietam. Kirby Smith had marched nearly across Kentucky, threatening Cincinnati, and success of more or less importance had attended Southern arms in other localities. In the West, the Union arms had won at Fort Donelson, Fort Henry, and in the battle for the possession of eastern Kentucky, where the Confederate commander Zollicoffer was killed, and the Union commander George H. Thomas won his first great victory. The Confederates had suffered severely at Pea Ridge in Arkansas, although no material advantage was gained on either side. McCulloch, the noted Texas Ranger, fell, and the picturesque Albert Pike, with his 2,000 Indians, lent additional interest to the scene. On both sides of the Mississippi, the Union forces were advancing. Kentucky and all northern Tennessee and Missouri and northern Arkansas had been abandoned to Union occupation. The possession of the Mississippi River from its source to its mouth and the cutting in twain of the Confederate territory became for the Southwest the dominating policy of the Union authorities, the logical sequence of which would be to cut off Confederate food supplies from Texas and the Trans-Mississippi. The success of this policy was becoming assured by rapidly recurring and decisive blows. Island No. 10, above Memphis, fell, forcing the evacuation of Fort Pillow and of Memphis, thus breaking Confederate control of this great waterway at every point north of Vicksburg. Farragut, the brilliant admiral, had battered his way through Confederate gunboats and forts from the Mississippi's mouth to New Orleans. This foremost genius of the Union Navy, whose father was a friend of Andrew Jackson's and whose mother was a North Carolina woman, had learned his first lesson in heroism from this Southern mother as she stood with uplifted axe in the door of their cabin home, defending her children from the red savages of the mountains. General Benjamin F. Butler, who had advocated the nomination of Jefferson Davis for president in the Charleston Convention, 1860, had marched his troops into New Orleans and taken possession of the city. Along the Atlantic coast, point after point held by Confederates was falling before the mighty naval armament of the United States. No Confederate navy existed to dispute its progress. General Burnside, in his expedition to North Carolina, had captured Fort Macon and New Bern. The cities of Fernandina and Jacksonville, Florida, were unable to stand against the fire from the fleet of Commodore DuPont. In Hampton Roads, Virginia, had occurred the first battle of perfected ironclads in the world's history, and one of the most furious in the annals of naval engagements. The Confederate Virginia and the United States Monitor in a few days had revolutionized the theories of scientific seamen and made the ironclad the future monarch of the water. The United States frigate Merrimac, which had been scuttled and sunk by its former crew, was raised from its deep grave by the Confederates and remodelled under the direction of Captain J. M. Brooke of Virginia. It was covered with a sloping roof of railroad iron, plastered over with plumbago and tallow, and rechristened Virginia. From this roof of greased iron the heaviest solid shot of the most powerful guns glanced like india-rubber balls from a mound of granite and whizzed harmlessly into the air. With its steel-pointed prow, the Virginia crashed into the side of the United States warship Cumberland, tearing a huge hole through which the rushing waters poured into her hull, carrying her to the bottom with the gallant Federals who had manned her. Under the belching fires of this floating volcano, with its crater near the water's surface and its base line 3 feet below it, the United States frigate Congress was forced to surrender. The most thrilling scene, however, in this great struggle of naval monsters was that witnessed when the Union ironclad Monitor, designed by Captain John Erickson, engaged the ironclad Virginia at close quarters. The pointed beak of the Virginia could make no impression upon the armour of the Monitor. The heaviest shots of each bounded off from the sides of the other, doing no practical damage even when at closest range. These two heralds of the new era in naval construction and naval battles were buried at last in that element the warfare upon which they had completely revolutionized, the Virginia in the James River, the Monitor in the Atlantic off Hatteras. The great military leaders on the two sides were just beginning to attract the attention of their countrymen and to fix the gaze of Christendom. George H. Thomas, who was regarded by Confederate officers as one of the ablest of the Union commanders, was steadily building that solid reputation, the general recognition of which found at last popular expression in the sobriquet, Rock of Chickamauga, a title resembling that conferred upon Jackson at Bull Run, and for a similar service. Sheridan, who afterward became the most famous cavalryman of the North, was beginning to win the confidence of his commanders and of his northern countrymen. McDowell, who was the classmate and friend at West Point of his opponent Beauregard, and whose ability as a soldier was recognized by Confederate leaders, had been defeated at Bull Run, the first great battle of the war, and had been supplanted by McClellan. It was my privilege to confer with General McClellan during the exciting and momentous period preceding the inauguration of President Hayes, and he impressed me then, as he had impressed his people in 1862, as a man of great personal magnetism and vivacious intellect. After the 7 days' battles around Richmond, McClellan was replaced by General John Pope. That officer, who had ingloriously failed to make good his prophecy that his army would henceforth look only upon the backs of the enemy, and who, contrary to his prediction, found that even he must consider lines of retreat at 2nd Manassas, had been sent to another field of service when General McClellan was reinstated in command. President Lincoln, however, is said to have soon desired greater activity, and to have wittily suggested that if General McClellan had no special use for the army, he would like to borrow it. Whether this characteristic suggestion was ever made by the President or not, it is certain that the army was later entrusted to General Burnside, with whom I served afterward in the Senate, and who was respected by all in that chamber for his stainless record as legislator and exalted character as man and patriot. General Burnside, after his defeat by Lee at Fredericksburg, had, at his own request, been relieved of the command of the army. General Hooker, his successor, who as long as the war lasted, fought with heroism and devotion, and after it ended entertained his Southern friends with the lavish hand of a prince, had lost the great battle of Chancellorsville. Although this admirable officer, by his devotion to his duties as commander, had so enhanced the efficiency of his army in numbers and discipline that he felt justified in pronouncing it the finest army on the planet, he also had asked to be relieved of chief command because of some conflict of authority. His successor was General George Gordon Meade, of whom I shall have more to say in another connection. The reputations of Sherman and of Grant were now eclipsing those of other commanders. General Sherman, with Memphis as his base, was threatening to overrun the Confederate States on the east bank of the Mississippi, while Stephen D. Lee, a brilliant campaigner, pronounced by competent authority one of the most effective commanders on the Confederate side, was throwing his little army across General Sherman's lines of advance and retarding his progress. Sherman, however, was advancing and laying the foundations upon which he was to build the imposing structure of his future fame. Grant was piling victory upon victory and steadily mounting to the heights to which destiny and his country were calling him. On the Confederate side, a great light had gone out when Albert Sidney Johnston fell. In comparative youth, he had rendered signal service to Texas in her struggle for independence. In the war with Mexico, he had evoked from old rough and ready Zachary Taylor, the commanding general, praises that were neither few nor meagre. In Utah, he had been the government's faithful friend and strong right arm. A Kentuckian by birth, he had in his veins some of the best of American blood. Like Washington and Lee, he combined those singularly attractive qualities which inspired and held the love and confidence of his soldiers, while commanding the respect and admiration of the sages of West Point. In him, more than in any other man at that period, were centered the hopes of the Southern people. He fell in the morning of his career, leading his steady lines through the woods at Shiloh, and in the very hour of apparently assured victory. As the rich life-current ebbed through the severed artery, he closed his eyes on this scene of his last conflict, confident of his army's triumph, and with the exultant shouts of his advancing legions sounding a requiem in his ears. The immediate successor of Albert Sidney Johnston was Pierre Gustave Touton Beauregard, who was an officer of ability and sincerely patriotic. Had circumstances favoured it, he would have found the broadest field for usefulness at some point, where his great skill as an engineer could have been utilised. During the initiative period of the war, prior to the first great battle of Bull Run, it was my privilege to serve under General Beauregard and to learn something of those cheery, debonair characteristics which helped to make him the idol of the vivacious Creoles of Louisiana. After the war, a Virginian, an ardent admirer of General Lee, was extolling the great commander-in-chief in a conversation with one of Beauregard's devoted Creole adherents. The Louisianian listened for a moment to the Virginian's praise of Lee, and then replied, Lee, Yes, seems to me I did hear Beauregard speak very well of Lee. Louisiana furnished another successor to the lamented Albert Sidney Johnston in the person of General Braxton Bragg. This officer, who was one of President Davis's special favorites, becoming late in the war a military advisor of the Confederate president, was a noted artillerist and would possibly have done greater execution in directing the movements of field batteries, which was a specialty, than in directing the movements of an army or handling it in battle. General Bragg was undoubtedly a man of ability, but his health was bad, and unfortunately his temper was no better. His reference, though in semi-private conversation, to one of his most prominent officers as an old woman, and his declaration that he had few men under him capable of command, were in strange contrast to the confidence felt by the country in those officers, and were especially in contrast with the spirit of Lee in assuming for himself the responsibility for defeat, while giving the honours of success to his juniors. When General Bragg was indulging in these criticisms of his officers, he had under him those brilliant soldiers, the accomplished, alert, and dashing E.C. Walthall, late United States Senator from Mississippi, Patrick Cleburne, whose warm Irish blood and quick Irish intellect made him conspicuous in every fight, and who in the desperate charge at Franklin, Tennessee, was killed on the defences behind which the Union Army had been posted, and W.H.T. Walker, who as a boy had won his spurs fighting Indians at Okeechobee, and who was afterward desperately wounded in Mexico, recovering, as he said, to spite the doctors. He lost his life at last in battle at Atlanta, and left a reputation for courage equal to that of Ney. There was also in Bragg's army at that time the accomplished and brave Bate, of Tennessee, who was repeatedly wounded and finally maimed for life, and whose old war horse, shot at the same time, followed his wounded owner to the hospital tent and died at its door, moaning his farewell to that gallant master. There were also Cheatham and Polk, of whom I have spoken in a former chapter, and a galaxy of able men of whom I would gladly write. There were also with Bragg the knightly cavalryman Joseph Wheeler, and N.B. Forrest, the Wizard of the Saddle, who was one of the unique figures of the war, and who, in my estimation, exhibited more native untutored genius as a cavalry leader than any man of modern times. Like the great German emperor who thought the rules of grammar were not made for his majesty, Forrest did not care whether his orders were written according to Murray or any other grammarian, so they meant to his troops, "Fight on, men, and keep fighting till I come." Lieutenant General Hardee was also one of Bragg's corps commanders. This officer, who was an accomplished tactician, had made a record which many thought indicated abilities of a high order, fitting him for chief command of the Western Army. Another of his corps commanders was the chivalrous John B. Hood, who, at Atlanta in 1864, was named by President Davis to succeed General Joseph E. Johnston, who was removed from chief command. In commenting on the picturesque and high-spirited Hood, a whole chapter might be consumed, but I shall confine myself to a few observations in regard to him. As division or corps commander, there were very few men in either army who were superior to Hood, but his most intimate associates and ardent admirers in the army never regarded him as endowed with those rare mental gifts essential in the man who was to displace General Joseph E. Johnston. To say that he was as brave and dashing as any officer of any age would be the merest commonplace tribute to such a man, but courage and dash are not the sole or even the prime requisites of the commander of a great army. There are crises, it is true, in battle, like that which called Napoleon to the front at Lodi, and caused Lee to attempt to lead his men on May 6th in the Wilderness, and again at Spotsylvania, May 12, 1864, when the fate of the army may demand the most daring exposure of the commander-in-chief himself. It is nevertheless true that care and caution in handling an army, the forethought which thoroughly weighs the advantages and disadvantages of instant and aggressive action, are as essential in a commander as courage in his men. In these high qualities, his battles at Atlanta and later at Franklin would indicate that Hood was lacking. I am persuaded and have reason to believe that General Lee thought Joseph E. Johnston's tactics wiser, although they involved repeated retreats in husbanding the strength and morale of his army. Bosquet said of some brilliant episode in battle, "It is beautiful, but it is not war." Hood, like Jackson, thought battle a delightful excitement. But Jackson, with all his daring and apparent relish for the fray, was one of the most cautious of men. His terrible marches were inspired largely by his caution. Instead of hurling his troops on breastworks in front, which might have been beautiful, he preferred to wage war by heavy marching in order to deliver his blow upon the flank. His declaration that it is better to lose 100 men in marching than 1,000 in fighting is proof positive of the correctness of the estimate I place on his caution. Ewell once said that he never saw one of Jackson's staff approaching without expecting an order to storm the North Pole. But if Jackson had determined to take the North Pole, he would have first considered whether it could be more easily carried by assaulting in front or by turning its flank. Hood had lost a leg in battle, and when the amputation was completed, an attempt was made to console him by the announcement that a civil appointment was ready for him. With characteristic impetuosity, he replied, "No, sir, no bomb-proof place for me. I propose to see this fight out in the field." This undiminished ardour for military service calls to mind the many other soldiers of the Civil War and of all history, whose loss of bodily activity in no way impaired their mental capacity. Ewell, with his one leg, not only rode in battle like a cowboy on the plains, but in the whirlwind of the strife his brain acted with the precision and rapidity of a Gatling gun. General Daniel E. Sickles, of New York, who was an able representative in Congress, continued his active and conspicuous service in the field long after he lost the leg, which was shivered by a Confederate ball, as the brave men in grey rushed up the steep of Little Round Top at Gettysburg. The United States Senate since the war has been a conspicuous arena for one-legged Confederates. The former illustrious senators of South Carolina, Hampton and Butler, and the combative and forceful Berry of Arkansas, each stood upon his single leg, an able and aggressive champion of democratic faith, and it is certain that the brilliant oratory of Daniel, of Virginia, is none the less Websterian, because the missile in the wilderness mangled his leg and maimed him for life. Marshal Saxe, who ran away from home and joined the army at the age of 12, and who became one of the most famous soldiers of his day, gathered for France and his own brow the glories of Fontenoy, while he was carried amidst his troops on a litter. The most illustrious patrician in the Republic of Venice, the sightless hero whom Lord Byron called the blind old Dandolo, achieved for his country its most brilliant naval victories. No account, however, of the mental vigour which has distinguished many maimed soldiers would be complete without reference to a Union soldier who lost both legs. My first meeting with Corporal Tanner, to whom I allude, was many years ago, on the cars between Washington and Richmond. He was on his way to the former capital of the fallen Confederacy. The exuberance of his spirits, the cordiality of his greeting, and the catholicity of his sentiments arrested my attention and won my friendship at this first meeting. In the course of the conversation, I jocularly asked him if he were not afraid to go to Richmond without a bodyguard. "Well," he said, "I left both my legs buried in Virginia soil, and I think a man ought to be allowed peaceably to visit his own graveyard." A few years later, I sat on a platform with Tanner before a great audience in Cooper Institute, New York. This audience had assembled for the purpose of considering ways and means to aid in the erection of a Confederate soldiers' home in Richmond. I had in my pocket a liberal contribution from General Grant, and after announcing this fact with a few additional words, I called for Tanner as the speaker of the evening. He stood tremblingly on the 2 wooden pins that served him as legs and began by saying, "My whole being is enlisted in this cause, from the crown of my head down to the as far as I go." Those who were present at the great gathering of Confederates in the vast assembly hall at Richmond during the last days of June 1895 will not soon forget his speech on that occasion. This maimed Union veteran, surrounded by Confederates, was pressed to the front of the platform amidst the wildest acclamations of his former foes. Every fibre of his body quivering with emotion, Tanner poured into the ears and hearts of his auditors a torrent of patriotic eloquence that evoked a demonstration such as rarely greets any man. In his case, the loss of his legs seems to have added vigour to his brain and breadth to his heart. The brief comments I have made upon General Hood's career as commander of an army are in no degree disparaging to his clear title to the gratitude of the Southern people. They are penned by as loyal a friend as he had in the Confederate Army. No devoted Theban ever stood at the tomb of Epaminondas with keener appreciation of his great virtues than is mine of the high qualities of the great-hearted and heroic Hood. These views were not withheld from General Lee when the selection of a new commander for the Confederate Army at Atlanta was in contemplation. When President Davis asked General Lee for an opinion as to the wisdom of removing General Johnston from the command of that army, General Lee did me the honour, as I presume he honoured other corps commanders, to counsel with me as to the policy of such an act. I had served under General Johnston while he commanded the Army of Northern Virginia. I had learned by experience and observation how he could retreat day after day, and yet retain the absolute confidence of his officers and men, who were ready at any moment to about face, and, with an enthusiasm born of that confidence, assume the offensive at his command. I therefore expressed the opinion that there was no one except General Lee himself who could take General Johnston's place without a shock to the morale of his troops that would greatly decrease the chances of checking General Sherman. Hood and others were discussed, and I ventured the suggestion that if the time should ever come for the removal of General Johnston, it would be after he had lost, and not while he still retained, as he clearly did, the enthusiastic confidence of his army, from the commanders of corps to the privates in the ranks. I may here remark that General Lee was perhaps the most unassuming of great commanders. Responsibilities that clearly belonged to him as a soldier he met promptly and to the fullest extent, but he was the last man holding a commission in the Confederate Army to assume authority about which there could be any question. Especially was this true when such authority was placed by the Constitution or laws in the hands of the President. Nothing could tempt him to cross the line separating his powers from those of the civil authorities. That line might be dim to others, but it was clear to him. This delicacy was exhibited again and again, even during the desperate throes in the last death struggle of his army. I cannot be mistaken, however, as to his opinion of the suggested removal of General Johnston and the promotion of General Hood or anyone else to the chief command. While he avoided any direct reply to my suggestions, he said enough to indicate his opinions. I could not forget his expressions, and I give, I believe, the exact words he used. He said, "General Johnston is a patriot and an able soldier. He is upon the ground, and knows his army and its surroundings, and how to use it better than any of us." This was the extent of his comment, and ended the interview. He never again alluded to the subject. General Lee was influenced in this case, as always, by a possibly too extreme reluctance to assume powers vested in the head of the government. While there was more or less complaint and criticism of Mr. Davis's management, it could not be otherwise during the progress of so stupendous an enterprise. The confidence reposed in his ability and consecration was unshaken, and General Lee heartily shared in this confidence. The threadbare adage, "Uneasy lies the head that wears a crown," found a fit illustration of its truth in the experience of Jefferson Davis, as it did in that of George Washington and of Abraham Lincoln. In the case of Washington, criticism ceased when he retired to Mount Vernon. In the case of Abraham Lincoln, all carpings and all divisions were lost in the universal sorrow of the whole American people when he became the victim of the murderous bullet of an insane assassin. So Jefferson Davis, when imprisoned, became the representative martyr of his whole people. Every one of them was ready to share with him all responsibility for the struggle, to the chief conduct of which they had called him by their votes. I feel sure that so long as this vicarious suffering of Mr. Davis lasted, General Johnston himself would have been unwilling to publish any statements as to the controversy between them, though he might have deemed such statements necessary for his own vindication. The strained relations between them originated in an honest difference of opinion as to the relative rank to which General Johnston was entitled among the 5 full generals. It is wholly immaterial to my present purpose to inquire which was right. The position of either could be sustained by forceful arguments. From my knowledge of both President Davis and General Johnston, I feel justified in saying that the spirit which prompted them differed essentially from that which impelled the Duke of Wellington and Talleyrand each to desire the first place in the picture in which the Allied sovereigns were to appear. Personal ambition played a very small part in the conduct of the serious enterprise in which the South was embarked. I could not fail to be deeply concerned, as all Southerners were, as to the effect of this alienation between the President and one of the South's ablest commanders. Honoured with the close personal friendship of both after the war, I had abundant opportunity for learning the peculiarities of each, that trenchant truism of Plato. No man governs well who wants to govern, finds no illustration in the lives of these patriotic men. The high positions and responsibilities of both came to them unsought. Their characteristics were cast in similar moulds and were of the most inflexible metal. While courteous in intercourse, each was tenacious in holding and emphatic in expressing convictions. The breach, therefore, once made was never healed. President Davis wished General Johnston to assume the offensive, with Dalton as a base of operations. General Johnston felt that his army, which had been beaten back from Missionary Ridge in great confusion, could not safely inaugurate the movement. The President felt that it was his right as constitutional head of the Confederate government to know when and where his general intended to make a stand. That general, who had made a retreat from Dalton to Atlanta, in which he had lost no wagons, no material of any description except 4 pieces of artillery, and none of the enthusiastic confidence of his officers or men, with but few killed or wounded in the almost daily skirmishes and combats, failed to give to the government at Richmond such information of his plans and such assurances of his hopes of success as were expected. A man of great caution, but of towering capabilities, General Johnston had husbanded his army's strength and resources in this long retrograde movement so as to make it one of the most memorable in military annals. But I think he should have frankly and confidently stated where he intended to make a final stand, from which he expected most satisfactory results. Failing to do this, he will probably be judged by history as failing to meet in the fullest measure his duty to the President. On the other hand, President Davis, having placed in command this officer, who had few if any superiors in any age or in any army, should probably have imitated the example of Louis XV, who said to the great Marshal in command of his forces that he expected all to obey, "And I will be the first to set the example."